The Secure in Mind podcast series is an educational initiative of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, or CyAN. CyAN is an international not-for-profit trust network of experts in technology, policy, ethics, and good practice. Our mission is to strengthen society's safety, resilience, and ability to fight against cybercrime and similar threats. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network. Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network Secure in Mind podcast and video conversation series. As always, these are very informal, friendly chats with subject matter experts, movers and shakers, and others around the information security, trust, safety, and resilience space. My name is John Solomon. I'm a member of the CyAN board, so it's my pleasure to welcome today Shantanu Bhattacharya. He is not only a fellow CyAN member for quite a while now, but also the CEO and founder of an organization that, full disclosure, I advise, 360 Security, as well as a serial entrepreneur located in, I believe it's Sydney, Australia. Or are you Canberra? Canberra, right. Yeah, sorry. I did all kinds of melds into an Antipodean blur, so this is the Australians will doubtlessly crucify me for that. 360 Security is an interesting proposition because it's an unconventional approach to not only a topic that is not really seen as I think traditionally sexy in today's climate of buzzword-driven cybersecurity focus around cloud, AI, etc. Because when Shantanu first approached me, the focus was purely on file and data security, and I am a firm believer in boring, right, bread and butter, because this, not buzzwords, underpins concepts of security. Shantanu, however, is also a very experienced hand so far at topics around LLM optimization security. And what I'm supporting and we're working on with this endeavor is basically bringing these two concepts under one roof. It's not something that instinctively, nor for me either, was innately related. And I've since become to realize that there is a very intriguing linkage and connection between these two seemingly disparate topics. What I'd like to talk to you today about is primarily the file security aspect of this, right? The data security aspect. And we'll spend a little bit of time on the other elements afterwards. But without any further ado, why don't you maybe introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background, where you come from, how you've positioned yourself as one of the go-to people for this kind of data, these aspects of data security, and what direction you want to bring the conversation in today.
Yep, sure. Thank you very much, John, for giving me this opportunity. And yeah, so without any further ado, going back to where I started, I actually started as a computer scientist in Indian Defense Research and Development Organization, and then had a chance to work on TCP/IP stack when they still had to be bought. So I built them and secured them. That was my journey, or the initial journey into cybersecurity. And then obviously cybersecurity was much more nascent stage than what it is now, because computing has also become very pervasive nowadays. And so the cybersecurity along with it has become all pervasive as well. So that is my beginning of journey with cybersecurity. But I have built products. I have built PKI product suite. I have also, built secure products, which is into hospital information systems and things like that, where I had, brushed with cybersecurity. And now I advise to various different government departments in Australia. Sometimes I even advise the CISO and the deputy CISO of the department. And as such, I've had some experience doing the development, doing the architecture, and then the consulting to bring it all together kind of thing into cybersecurity. In terms of how I started with data security, data obviously is a very critical resource for most of the organizations. And without being able to keep it, secure, a lot of the business will, start sort of tumbling down. And that's where I thought that data has to be secured. And one of the things which I saw is the traditional approach of data security is a little bit of a patch like thing, not the solution at the fundamental level. So I started to think of data right at the fundamental level as to how operating systems deal with data. And as such, strengthen the operating system's mechanism to protect the data. And that way we can probably recover from many of the things which are normally not detected by the data protection solutions. And that's the difference that I actually focused on. And that's what I am going to discuss with you today as well.
So I gotta say I had to smile before when when you mentioned terms like PKI and buying IP stacks as add-on components. It's always fun to talk to somebody from the same generation because it's such a completely different take on the backstory of today's IT than somebody who's just cloud native or DevOps focused. So on the data side, I think it's for me, it's a very interesting topic because, coming as I do to a large degree from a risk management background. And I think a lot of organizations don't really still don't understand the idea of assets, right? What is the most important element of their business is essentially the data that you have with usually a thin layer of functionality and applications on top. I think it's worth differentiating between data and information essentially being processed, contextualized data. So, I come from a Unix background. You are primarily from a Windows background. I think it would be nice to compare notes in the direction that you just mentioned, which is, how does the operating system, the kernel, the file system layer see data? Structured, unstructured files, data blobs. What is this? For the novice viewer with a little bit of technological understanding, what is your take on how this abstract of an operating system and the applications that run on it see the stuff that you have stored and the stuff that you're processing?
Absolutely. Very good question and very pertinent one at that. So if we look at Unix, then if we look at the file system, which is the custodian of all the data in any operating system, then actually in Unix, even the devices, as we all know, actually represent themselves as files and things like that. Block devices, character devices, and all of those kind of things. So that is one way that Unix deals with data, because even when it talks about devices, it actually sees them as, data in some form, and therefore it converts that into file systems. On the other hand,
mention maybe that we when we talk about Unix, we're talking primarily about block data, block devices,
block
right?
data,
So
yes.
Not so much raw devices for data stream IO, but the actual the chunks of predefined size. So anybody who has formatted a hard disk or an USB drive has seen block size. So how many little elements of, for example, hard disk or SSD or whatever storage make up this virtual construct that is a file, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the Unix perspective. In case of Windows, it actually takes a slightly different take, because in Windows, they have a concept of alternate data streams. And what that means is, on the face of it, you might just see a text file which says this is a text file only. But it can actually have an additional stream And in that additional stream, you can actually have an executable, which is hidden underneath, which then makes it, even more kind of difficult to protect, because you now can have multiple streams of data within the same file. And some of the streams actually could have malware, which can then be used to attack the system and everything else that it associates with. So
I was going to
that
say there was
is
a couple of years ago, there was a big thing about Windows ADSs being used as delivery channels for malicious content.
that is true. That is true. So that makes it much more complex in terms of the data security side of things. And in Windows, the devices are seen as devices and not as files like we have on Unix. But then the alternate data stream makes it more exciting in terms of the attackers and protectors. So that is the difference that is there. And another thing which I also wanted to bring to notice, and which is common across Linux as well as Windows, is that when the operating system boots, then at that time, it is actually starting with the kernel. So operating system actually bootstraps. And when it does bootstrapping, then it first loads the kernel and the core components of the operating system. And once the kernel is completely loaded, only then the file system or other components are activated. And then you can actually see the data. So while it is still in the kernel stage, if there is an attacker who has attacked at the kernel stage or at the BIOS, as in the EEPROM stage, then it can be much more complex to deal with the data protection. But what we do is we actually protect the file system, whether it be on Unix or whether it be on Windows. So we still work with the operating system and the kernel side of things, but not still able to protect against processes which can start interacting right at the time when it boots and it is still at the kernel. So if the kernel is poisoned, then our solution still is not able to detect 100%.
I mean,
but in other situations, yeah,
that's going to be a common issue with, also for a while ago, a couple of years ago, there was a security researcher named Jana Rutkowska who was, who was talking a lot about the idea of red pill attacks, which are hypervisor poisoning, right? So at some level, when there is malicious content and control of a system at almost a meta level, I mean, if you control a kernel right at the stage of boot, then there's not a whole lot on system itself that's going to save you. So yeah,
exactly.
I think it's a good point to go back to the topic I touched on before. In your preparatory notes, you mentioned as units of data, right?
Yes.
So if we visualize, so the boot sequences, you have a BIOS, you have the hardware basically that says where on a physical storage medium or elsewhere there is the kernel, this main brain process that it loads into memory. The kernel will then basically look at the BIOS to see, well, what's physical storage media or memory media do I have? Where on those can I go find various bits of information? That's the file system, right? So where on the file system in my directory tree, for example, do I go find various devices? Where can I launch processes? And then, okay, we have files. So what is that?
Yep. So basically what happens there, as you mentioned, in case of Windows, is a master boot record, which actually starts off the booting process. And once the master boot record, which is on the disk, it actually starts executing. It actually brings it into the memory and starts executing. And once it executes and loads the kernel through the bootstrapping, then it starts even understanding what a file system is and then it is able to recognize the files and things like that. And that is very similar in the case of Unix as well. So during the kernel kind of startup, the files are not visible, but the moment the kernel is loaded, then the file system component comes on, and then it starts viewing the disk or the space on the disk as the file system. And then it can actually deal with the files as it sees and then sort of do all the operations around that. Your audio is gone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I knew that. Sorry about that. Seeing if you're paying attention. Well done. Just maybe a quick note. The MBR is mostly for those of you who are newer to the Windows world, especially. MBR is mostly superseded by GPT. Although they can sit side by side. But it's essentially the same idea. It's basically a place at a predefined location on a storage medium that is essentially a map to where the kernel can then go find things.
Absolutely.
All right. So we've now established. So we have files. We have a file system, which is essentially the layout, the roadmap of where things are. What defines things like what does a directory look like? What are these atomic units of files? We're not going to talk about exotic file systems, RiserFS, for example. We're not going to talk about raw file systems. So there's a lot of data lakes, for example. You may have heard of these if you're listening to this, which are completely different approaches to storing very, very large amounts of data and processing it quickly. There's concepts like unstructured data and structured data, which are exactly what they sound like. I guess the best analogy I can think of is Zoomers who don't put their mails into folders, but rather just search for keywords. Whereas, we olds, we like to try and hierarchically classify our files and our emails so we know where to go look for them. But I think you touched on, I think what's important here is you touched on alternate data streams under Windows. And the closest equivalent to Unix I can think of, there are some file systems that support certain types of metadata for files, but I think it's interesting to go into this topic that you also brought up is what can and cannot the OS see. Assuming that the attacker doesn't control the kernel or even the hypervisor or the hardware and the BIOS this thing runs on, right? Assuming that we have some level of authority left to us, but there's a malicious attacker, I guess they're all malicious, who is able to introduce certain dubious things masquerading as legitimate content. What can the kernel not see? So it can see alternate data streams. What can I hide from it?
Yeah. So what happens is in all our modern processors that there is a very good separation between the code segment, the data segment, the heap, and things like that, and the stack, of course. But then what happens is you can still go and overwrite the file. And when you overwrite the file in a way that it can lead to, for example, a stack heap collision, just because it keeps.
What is that?
Yeah. So basically what can happen is you can recursively, for example, call a same function over and over again, and the stack keeps growing. And at one point, the stack space allocated for the stack is filled up, and then it hits the heap. And at that point in the heap, if you have a malicious code, then the malicious code gets executed, and you can, as an attacker, get control over the process. So this is one way that the attackers currently use to attack. Other ways,
a very quick note. So a lot of this goes into somewhat exotic spaces of memory types and management. So I'll put links defining stack memory versus heap memory in the video description on our blog post. But also it's good to note that a very, very large portion of attacks in the recent, I'd say 2 decades even, have relied on manipulation of memory. You know, whether it's collisions, whether it's buffer overflows, anything that can either confuse or otherwise mess with the operating systems or even the user space's perception of what is going on in memory, masquerading, for example, as something legitimate or replacing something legitimate. So a lot of this is basically what is happening in the memory space, which is the temporary working space the operating system uses. Most of the less technical people watching this will know this as essentially RAM.
Yes, that is exactly true. So that is one way, for example, of attacking a process. Another way of attacking, for example, through the network is to actually either, for example, in case of TCP IP itself, there is a two-way handshake that happens, in which case what can be done is you can do the first handshake and keep the second handshake pending. And that way you can actually attack the system by creating a DOS or distributed DOS, denial of service attack kind of thing. And once the system is in the denial of service mode, then you can actually attack it to use any of the 0-day or other vulnerabilities of existing network stack and then gain control of the process that way. So there are other such ways of attacking which are very commonly used. But what I basically wanted to note here is that the operating system comes with certain level of protection for the data. But that is found to be wanting in many cases because the operating system, when it looks at data, it only protects it from who is the owner of the data or who has the group ownership of the data or who is actually having some read access or write access to that data. But
and I think if I can very quickly, I think it's also good to note here that we have to distinguish between attacks that rely on fooling the user, okay? Whether it's, for example, opening a file that's masquerading as something legitimate, or attacks that are automated, which rely, for example, I think we have less common kind of 0-day vulnerabilities nowadays, as opposed to maybe 15 years ago, that use an operating system vulnerability or an IP, a TCP stack based issue. Then, for example, spoofing a type of file, getting a user to load a malicious code loader that introduces something into memory space. And then once it's actually on the local machine, we again have to differentiate between things that use escalated privileges of a user and things which use a misconfiguration or another vulnerability in the operating system or a privileged part of that to introduce themselves. So it gets really complex. So we're trying to protect not only against things that are automated, but also against something that a stupid systems administrator or user might be doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what I was saying as a point was the operating system actually sees the data in terms of who is the owner or which group it belongs to or which is the other kinds of users who have some access to the data. That is generally the lines of thinking, but that is actually, according to me, is a little bit of a rudimentary kind of protection that can be provided, because when there is data, then the data and there is a possibility of somebody accessing that data. They not only use the program to access the data, they have a user identity which also is required to access the data and a device which is also required to access the data.
So basically, when you log in, traditional login is just user. So you're basically talking about adding an additional element. So conventional approach to authenticating a user is one of three things: who you are, what you know, and what you have. So it's essentially who you are and what you know. So your username and your
And
password,
what you have as well. Yes.
the device in this case.
Yes. So that if you actually do a little bit more holistic approach to how the data is protected, then I think it can work in more scenarios and it can provide more protection as well. And like we said, that if we now do that protection at the operating system level itself, then there is no other way that the user can access the data, but we have not been able to identify that they are trying to access the data. So then the problem becomes a little simpler because now we have got more protection around that.
Go back a sec. You mentioned we can't identify how they're accessing that data. So I want to open a file, for example, or I'm running an application that wants to open a file. Can you walk that as a concrete example?
Yep, sure. So when in the current scenario, when you try to access the data, like I said, we only look at, or the operating system looks at, who has the ownership of the data or who is part of the group who has access to the data, or who are the others who have access to the data. That is the approach it takes, which is largely based on the user credentials, which you have used to log into that system to access the data. But then you do require a software to access the data, and you also require a device to access the data. So what I am now saying is, if we strengthen the operating system to look at those aspects as well, and we have a way of looking at it from the operating system perspective, then there is no one else who can come and try to access the data without letting our monitoring service know that somebody is trying to access the data. And once we find out that somebody is trying to access the data, and if we verify all three aspects, like what we are talking about, the user credential, the software program, and the device, then we have more or less protected against all different types of access and all different types of defrauding the access mechanism. So that is what gives you a little bit more of a foolproof thing. I don't say that that is 100% foolproof, because you can still have fileless attacks that can happen. But we can discuss that at a later point.
You can't. There's a wonderful term in German, the eierlegende Wollmilchsau, the egg-laying wool milk pig, right? The does everything, sees everything, knows everything. You have to select what you protect against, and you have to understand your risk management posture to see what are the gaps still. I think what's useful to talk about is we should differentiate between, I'd say, protective and reactive, right? Preventative essentially lets me stop something based on the user or the process not having sufficient authorization to do a certain thing, like alter a file, like introduce malicious content into memory, whatever. Whereas reactive is, if potentially we don't have the tools or the ability to stop it, we should at least be aware of it, right? So your detective controls, essentially, it logs something, make sure that you are aware of it. How do we ensure that when we have this kind of a responsive detective control, that exactly the kind of attack that is introducing a malicious, dodgy content onto a system isn't also influencing the logging mechanism, the alerting mechanism?
Yes, so there are various ways that people actually dodge the logging mechanism and things like that. There is a whole topic on that called repudiation, which is actually completely based on that, one of the basic things is most of the software which create the log files don't really encrypt the log files themselves. So that is a basic thing which goes unprotected. But generally, people try to keep the log files in directory with less permissions or permissions less pervasive as compared to the normal data files and things like that. So that is one way that is used to sort of protect against overwriting the log files, as in saying, I did the work, but then I changed the trace of it or the log file so that nobody is able to point finger at me that I did that change. So that is the thing, which is uh, used for non-repudiation kind of thing or repudiation kind of thing based
I love
on
that.
which perspective you are looking at it.
Having done a ton of work in PKIs as well, you can't imagine how happy it makes me that you use the term non-repudiation, because that's something that I think, a lot of people who are familiar with integrity just don't realize. So just maybe as a quick side note for differentiating the two, you have the integrity is ensuring that something is basically what it's supposed to be, whereas non-repudiation is that you cannot claim afterwards that, for example, you sent something that is actually different from what it is. And so digital signing is a part of that. So that's are we talking about primarily cryptographic techniques for example, signing log files, or?
Yeah, that can be one of the ways, but it actually makes it very difficult for a software to every time either sign the log file or encrypt the log file, just because these cryptographic operations actually have a significant amount of overhead with
I was going
them.
to say it's super resource intensive as
That is
technologically
exactly
attractive as it is.
Yes. So there has to be other ways, and that is what is currently used when they keep the log files, for example, in directories with very controlled permissions and things like that, so that it is not messed with. But what I also wanted to highlight here is the fact the way we are talking about the three-pronged approach of finding out whether the person's device and the person's software has the right access permissions, that can also strengthen the privileged access mechanism. So let's say, suppose I am a system admin and I am allowed to do certain administrative tasks, which is obviously high permission tasks that has been granted to me. When I try to do that uh, high permission task in the normal context, then only my user credentials is actually used to give me that permission in the normal operating system context. But what we are now saying is there are ways of privilege escalation, either by hacking the password, privileged password, or through other mechanisms which are very well known. Then what happens is you do not have any other fallback mechanism after that point. And with this three-pronged approach that we are talking about, where you also check whether they are using the rightful device and the rightful software to do that access, then you make the privileged access much more secure as well. So that is an additional benefit of providing that kind of security.
All right. I'd say I'd like to shift a little bit, like we mentioned earlier. So we've talked at length about securing data, mostly in file form, the limitations, the considerations, the architectural issues and concepts. So I'm hoping that through this whole rambling discourse across what an operating system looks like in terms of the file world, people now have a somewhat better idea of what they should be, thinking about when they open a PDF or whatever. I'd like to spend about 5 minutes talking about the LLM aspect of this. This is intriguing, right? And this is not a marketing topic for 360 security, right? Even though this, I want to be very clear. I want to be full disclosure. I advise Shantanu. Shantanu has a product, but we're talking about concepts here, right? The reason I want to bring this up is I was really intrigued by this idea. And I spent quite a bit of time thinking about what is the linkage between these two concepts. On the one hand, we have a lot of highly inefficient LLM usage in terms of resources. And on the other, we have this thing that for me instinctively is completely unrelated, securing data. Yeah. Now, as a security person, performance is innately linked to security. Yeah. For example, we touched on buffer overflows before. If you are on a technical level able to overload a system, then yeah, you're going to have an issue in terms of being able to maintain, for example, processes that keep that system secure. But LLM, right? It is one of the major new families of tools that's arisen in the last 5 years for treating large volumes of data, large volumes of information, I should say. What's the linkage? Give me some conceptual basis for discussion. Why are these things connected?
Yep, sure. So one of the things when we talk about LLMs, which you rightly mentioned, is actually currently they are trying to make it more and more efficient for the simple reason that it actually not only uses a lot of power, it generates a lot of heat, so it requires a lot of cooling. And then there are other problems related to that for the infrastructure providers, that they are struggling to make money, even though there are billions of customers using it, just because the LLM itself is quite not as efficient as we would like it to be. It actually makes it non-profitable.
But I would even go so far as to say they're incredibly resource hungry and inefficient ways of doing things, right? I think our artificial intelligence is one of the worst marketing terms ever, most deceptive marketing terms ever invented. I mean, a lot of it is simply brute forcing, stochastically parroting, to use Emily Bender's term for this, what it's been trained with. So just the power projections for OpenAI alone are pretty funny in a grim way.
Exactly right. Because if we look at a particular statistic, which actually surprised me as well, is the fact that in California, the state of California, which has an economy of the size of fourth largest economy of the world, their projection is by 2030, 25% of their energy consumption will be with AI. So that's the kind of AI's consumption of power and things like that. And since it deals with so much of data, it is very, very critical, and it deals with sensitive and crown jewel data all day long. So if it is not well protected, then it can quickly go awry. And in addition to it being inefficient, it also starts becoming harmful, and it can become dangerous very quickly. And that's why you need to protect the data it actually deals with, along with making it more efficient and things like that. And that is how the LLM optimization and the data security of the LLM is connected.
So you're essentially proposing the idea that in order to make sure that you're able to, how to put this, avoid, on the one hand, lack of availability of critical resources dealing with information access, and on the other hand, that to ensure that you're able to prevent, for example, malicious actors from using something that is, when your whole data handling architecture goes on the fritz due to lack of power, to lack of resources. It's part of your underlying risk management mechanism to ensure that you have sufficient resilience in all of. I mean, this could basically apply to things like network components
Exactly right.
as well, with the exception that these are so comparatively resource economical that it's not really worth even looking into, right? You have a UPS, it's just going to work, whereas your LLM usage is so pervasive and universal, and it's sucking down so much juice. For example, if your power goes offline from your battery arrays or your UPS, that if you're not able to run it as lean as possible, you're going to have a serious issue.
That is exactly true. And that is what we have to deal with, because AI or LLMs in general are becoming the mainstay, and they are becoming more and more used. And I can't see a timeline when it will saturate or even reduce. It will only increase. So the problem is going to become more complex as we see.
I think it's also an argument to be made that if things are running slowly.
That is true.
Yeah.
That is true. If the system is overwhelmed, then it is easy to break as well, because it is in a non-stable or unstable situation. And when it is in an unstable situation, an attack can be more successful, like we saw in the case of distributed denial of service or denial of service kind of situation, which we talked about a little earlier.
Well, it's essentially the modern equivalent of throwing a smoke grenade into an office building, right?
That is exactly true.
If you can obfuscate, things and confuse people and slow things down and break processes, then it's going to be much harder to protect the bank vault. With that, thank you for that. I think it's something that bears a lot of thinking about. I want to thank you very sincerely for taking the time. Do you have anything that you want to plug? Any comments you want to make to wrap up before we move on to greener pastures?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much again for your time as well, John. And what I just wanted to mention is, if you are interested in learning more about how data can be protected well at a fundamental level, or how LLM can be optimized at a fundamental level, feel free to reach out. And I will be more than happy to actually chat about it and see if I can help you in any which way.
Cool. So Shantanu, reach out to him on LinkedIn. I'll put his LinkedIn profile in the description. Drop him a line. Check out his company. He's done a bunch of publishing on the CyAN website as well. I'm trying to encourage him to do more. So consider this as a gentle prod. But I really appreciate your time and your contribution. Thanks also for your patience. This is the second attempt at recording this because our previous platform nuked my former effort, unfortunately. So I really appreciate the patience. And check out our other videos on our YouTube channel, our various podcast channels. Everything is under cybersecurityadvisors.network/media. And with that, stay safe and see you next time.
Not a problem. Thank you, everyone, as well.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure.